Members, I rise to present AGR 35, which commemorates the week of April 20th as Armenian Genocide Remembrance Week in California. Each year we commemorate the genocide of the Armenian people at the hands of the Ottoman Empire. We recall that 99 years ago, on the night of April 24th, one of the worst crimes in the annals of human history began with the arrest of 250 intellectuals and civic leaders of the Armenian community in what was then considered Constantinople. We recount the stories of the massacre, of the rapes and executions, the forced marches through the deserts of Syria with no food and no water. We remember the 1.5 million men, women, and children who lost their lives in a systematic and ruthless fashion. And we recommit ourselves to two powerful but important words: never forget. Never forget the stories of this crime, a crime beyond all scale of human history to that point. But more importantly, we must never forget that we have an obligation to act whenever we're confronted with crimes of this nature. We must remember the words of the British statesman Edmund Burke, who warned his colleagues in succeeding generations that the only thing needed for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And that is certainly true of the events we commemorate today. For 8 years, the Ottoman Empire waged a systematic campaign against Armenians living within their borders. Whole families were slaughtered. Entire villages were wiped out as the nations of the world stood by and did nothing. Just a few decades later, as the final solution was decimating millions across Europe, Hitler's chilling rationale was simple: who remembers the Armenians? The inaction of the world to the unmitigated evil of the Armenian genocide presaged the unmitigated evil of the Holocaust, which we will commemorate on this floor in a few weeks. Over the weekend, I was listening to an NPR program commemorating the 20th anniversary of the Rwanda genocide. The program featured Paul Rusesabagina, who sheltered more than 1,200 men and women and children in his hotel during the rampant massacre of the Tutsis. He's now an international lecturer on the causes of that genocide and often begins his lectures by discussing the realities of the Armenian genocide. It's a powerful reminder that it's not enough for us to mark a date on our calendars, that we must actively remember the stories of genocide and recommit ourselves to the lessons of history. That's especially true today. We're almost a century removed from the official beginning of the Armenian genocide, and we're more than a century removed from the massacres and pogroms officially and unofficially sanctioned by the Ottoman government, including by agents of the Sultan, in the years and decades leading up to that night in April of 1915. Across the globe, there are only a handful of men and women who are living who are witnesses to that era, and those folks were only children when they saw so many other children led to their deaths. That creates a powerful obligation for us. The witnesses who survived, the first generation of the diaspora who fled the Ottoman Empire and established thriving communities across the globe, including here in California, no longer remain to share their accounts as living witnesses. And that means that we must take up their mantle and share their stories to remind each successive generation of our obligation to act and prevent this kind of evil. That obligation was made particularly powerful for me and several of my colleagues last fall during an assembly delegation visit to Armenia with Mr. Achajian, Mr. Nazarian, Ms. Brown, Mr. Wilk, and some of our former colleagues who now serve on the Los Angeles City Council. During that trip, we had the honor of visiting the Genocide Memorial. It was a hallowed experience. Stepping out of our cars, we were all struck immediately by a powerful sense of emotion and a reminder of the enormity of the crimes. A simple shrine commemorates the deaths of 1.5 million people. And next to that shrine stands a modest museum which houses stories of the genocide. Now, one of the most striking things about the museum is the dearth of pictures. For those of us who have visited Yad Vashem in Israel or the Holocaust Memorial and Museum in Washington, D.C., we've seen hundreds of thousands of photos searing the memories of the crimes into our soul. But very few pictures exist of the Armenian genocide. And virtually all of the pictures that still exist were taken by German military observers. During our visit, we did see a temporary exhibit that had some very unique photos that served as a haunting reminder of our obligation to act. One was a collection of photos of some of the first victims of the genocide, many of whom were intellectuals. One of our former colleagues, Paul Krikorian, was with us, and he noticed a picture and pointed at it and realized that it was his uncle, Kachador Nahigian. He was one of the very first victims. Professor Nahigian had left his home to study mathematics at the University of Michigan, but he returned after the Young Turks' revolt, believing that his homeland would have changed for the better. He was living a simple, peaceful life as a professor of mathematics when on one night in June of 1915, he was arrested, tortured, and eventually executed as one of the first acts of the genocide. And though he died in that genocide, his idealism and the idealism of the other victims, his belief in the ability to create a better world lives on in the service of his nephew, who has served in our chamber and in the City Council of Los Angeles, as does our obligation to carry forward the hopeful spirit that faith in a better world and that vigilance against all those who would repeat these dark chapters in history of the world. We've seen chilling reminders of late. The present conflict in Syria has once again reared the specter of sectarian violence, and places like Aleppo, which had been the place where so many fled, have become synonymous with rampant violence and crimes against humanity. Armenians living in Kesab have been massacred and displaced, adding to the sum total of human suffering in the 3 years of conflict that has engulfed the nation of Syria. These events are reminders of our obligation to act to prevent and not stand silent as these terrible crimes are once again visited upon the world. And this resolution speaks to that obligation. It's simply not enough for us to remember the events. We must never forget how they came to pass and what our obligation is to prevent them in the future.